Cool. Okay, I think we're good to start. I have a bunch of folks. So we have not Brendan presenting, Patrick. He's I think second or third author on the paper. He probably knows a thing or two about it. So if you can, Patrick, I mean, I'm sure you already have everything set up, but it would be nice maybe to give a quick kind of historical overview of how you came to this, and maybe also say how it links to Simplex. Kind of, we're trying to link the sections together. So if you don't mind, like having that at some point. Otherwise, go for it.
Yeah, so as Sam noted, I am not Brendan, but I am shamelessly lazy if I can be. And so this is Brendan's presentation from a few months ago that he made that I thought was really, really good. And so I really liked how he presented it, but like over the last few months, we've made some awesome, further improvements to Minimmit and like kind of learned more about how it works as we've implemented it. And so planning to add some new color, on top of this old presentation. And so, yeah, but this is for you guys. So, recorders be darned, I guess. But yeah, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to stop me. So, so first off, I think to get right into it. Well, I'll talk a little bit about my experience with consensus, why I got really interested in Simplex, where that led, and then how I kind of stumbled into Minimmit, and then I can go from there. So I am not a PhD or even really a master's person. I have an undergraduate degree in computer science. I love this stuff. I find it really interesting, but I am not like a capital R researcher by any means. But I think consensus as like a useful primitive for building these type of systems is super interesting. But what I found from the get-go is there's a huge divide between what is written about in papers and then what it actually takes to implement something. The big gap really being that to basically prove anything in research, you need to have certain assumptions around like the way that the network or anything works. And a lot of times those assumptions revolve around this idea of eventual message delivery. So you'll send a message, and then at some point, in the partial synchrony model, the message will be delivered, but never dropped. Because if you allow for dropped messages, it's impossible to prove anything because in expectation, eventually, no messages will get to anybody. So what happens in practice is usually you have a really interesting consensus paper that inspires an implementation. And then there's a lot of extra room and scratch paper you got to fill in with all the mechanisms required to actually make it work in practice. Like, when are messages resent? How do you like kind of sync up to the tip? Where does all this retry logic happen? Should there be retries here? Is this a DOS to do this? How do you store stuff? A lot of very practical questions that ultimately significantly weigh down what can be like a really clean consensus implementation on paper. And so when I started to get into like a better understanding of consensus stuff, this delta really bothered me, and I found it really difficult to implement what would be like traditional like PBFT style or like chained consensus style things in code. Now, that's probably a skill issue on my part, but at the same time, it's complicated. And so if you want to do it, just know it's complicated to get it right. And even I think there was a Cosmos SDK or like Tendermint bug disclosure from even like a few days ago that was pretty interesting around time and median times. Like, bugs can go on for years. That was 6 years old without anyone realizing, because it's that nuanced and complicated. And so when I first saw Simplex, I was blown away. So it was at an IC3 event 2 years ago or 3 years ago now, I think. And Ben, one of the co-authors on the Simplex paper, was presenting it, and he's like, kind of like a 10-minute like lightning session thing. And I just heard it for the first time. I was like, I actually feel like I could implement this. Now that was a little deceptively simple, so that was one thing. But at the same time, like, if you look at the Simplex paper, it's a lot cleaner to follow. It makes trade-offs, but like I found it a lot easier to follow. And so that started my deep dive into like all things Simplex. And so I worked on Simplex, or like kind of really getting into it. But then I also actually wrote a few blogs that built on top of Simplex, probably the most interesting of which is something I call Vena, which is optimistically responsive consensus over large validator sets using like Simplex style stuff. So this is like inspired by like the work that E2 does to kind of try and scale broadcast, but done in a responsive, like with responsive consensus instead. So it has cool rules for like sending delta aggregate signatures and stuff like that. But ultimately, I was just very interested in this kind of line of research into the Simplex style consensus. But as we at Commonware, it was an obvious choice for us to start playing with. And so when I first started Commonware, I started with the P2P stuff. And then next question was cryptography. And then after cryptography was into consensus stuff. Things were all going well, like really enjoying the Simplex work. And then real credit to the folks at Solana, although they weren't the first ones to propose anything in like the 5F+1 security model or by any means. It was the first time it caught my attention. I was at the Solana Accelerate event, I think, where they announced Alpenglow. And imagine you're like running a small company or startup, you're trying to get things off the ground, and it's like, hey, there's actually like, maybe we like don't do the 33% thing, and instead we, do the 20% Byzantine tolerance, and it turns out you can go way faster. It's like, shoot. And so was really interested in that kind of transition, because it felt to me, at least the 33% line is like a thing we didn't cross, but it turns out, there's a lot of people that are willing to accept 20%. And why that matters, right, is impossibility results. So in the 33% model, like the best you can do for finalization is like propose, vote, finalize. But if you go to the 20% model, you can get away with only one round of voting, which is huge for efficiency, but also like just dramatically simplifies the protocol, because you don't have to worry about this like second step of voting and how to align it and do everything. Now, I thought Alpenglow was really cool, and I think what they're doing is really interesting. But they're optimizing for something that I thought we prefer to optimize for something else, and hadn't noted that anyone had tried it. So what Alpenglow and Kudzu and like some of these other protocols attempt to do, which are also, interestingly enough, kind of inspired by the Simplex protocol design, because I think I think it's a really awesome simplification if you don't actually care about linear broadcast, which in my opinion you shouldn't. That's another conversation. But basically in that world, they optimize for this notion of like an additive like crash fault tolerance. So I think Alpenglow calls this like 20 plus 20. And so the idea is that you can have 20% Byzantine faults and 20% crash faults, and it'll still go, which means that basically 40% of the network, if 20 and 20 are offline, or like 20% Byzantine and 20% offline, the thing will still run. Now, I think, as the first to propose like a breaching the, or like on stage at least propose like breaching the 32% barrier, like I think that was a reasonable choice, because it's like if you just say, hey, we're doing 20 now, like people might take that one way or another. But when I heard about it the first time, I was like, what if you like, could you do anything interesting there? And like kind of instead of using it for like an additive crash fault tolerance, instead go faster on the view side. Because ultimately when you're designing consensus mechanisms, all you really need to think about is quorums. And so all the tricks and everything come from like how to creatively think about quorums. And so the same kind of quorum use that gives you like the additive crash fault tolerance, could you kind of move that around and instead go for faster views? And the rationale there was basically, well, any application I've ever talked to, for better or worse, doesn't care about going from 33 to 40% or 33 to 20%. They kind of think of it all the same. What they do care about, though, is how do I go faster? Because the speed is like what the users want. The speed is like what gives you a competitive edge. The speed is where how you stay on the frontier. So if we instead said, let's drop this additive crash fault tolerance and instead focus on just going as fast as possible, what would that look like? So that's the intro to basically Minimmit, which stands for mini commit, is the naming scheme there. And the idea is that the mini commit is what gives you the ability to like move very fast view-wise. Now, some people have said, I don't understand the name Minimmit, which I'm always working on my branding skills, so I apologize for that, but it's too late now. So we'll see where that goes. Cool. So this talk is really talking about those high-level ideas that got us to what Minimmit is. And yeah, this was a joint work by Brendan, me, and Andy Lewis Pye. Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, like the real insight came from a leap that Brendan took when we were having some late night conversations about this. And so I want to just give him full credit for that. I had something in mind. It was not nearly as elegant. And then he was like, well, why don't we just do this? And I was like, there's no way that works. That's Minimmit. So, and so we go. Yeah, so we like simple stuff because you can implement it and you can understand it. So Minimmit in particular, we find painfully simple. And we think when you're looking at any consensus algorithm, hopefully you should be bored. That is the goal. So with that in mind, I don't know if this group really needs like the whole prime run consensus, but really all we focus about is like, how do we get agreement? Don't think about like broadcasting the blocks. Don't think about like anything like too specific there. Just say like, how can we get a stream of hashes or commitments or digests that a bunch of people that don't trust each other agree on? And that hopefully it stays going. So find a way to make sure that even after like crazy network events that liveness is maintained. So maybe it's temporarily slow or delayed, but that safety is never violated. And then eventually liveness recovers. And again, this is kind of a duplicate, which is like, yeah, we care about fault tolerance here. We expect Byzantine faults. In this case, we're operating under the model not of less than 33% fault tolerance, but under the model of less than 20% fault tolerance. Minimmit does not discriminate between faulty versus crash, unlike things like Kudzu or Alpenglow. So it's just 20%, and those people can do whatever they want. So that's just one of the trade-offs we make. And then, yep.
Okay, yeah, this is perfect. I actually had a question earlier. So I guess it's about all of these protocols, but as you were saying, so you're saying kind of the Alpenglow and the Kudzu went the route of, you know, adding more crash fault tolerance, which I always found a bit weird because like, are you, like, I guess you're adding a basically my question is, are you adding a 7% crash fault tolerant, or is it really more like they're going to 20 Byzantine fault, like reducing the Byzantine fault in order to get, you know, the 20% CFT? I guess that's related to my question here, which I didn't understand. So now you're saying that you...
Yeah, so I think Kartik is on this call, and yeah. I think their work with Hydrangea and Hydrangea++, they established, I think, a lower bound on like what can be tolerated in like the two-phase model of like a kind of like fault tolerance. So you can't really go above, I believe it's, what is it, a F in like a 5F-1 setting. So you can't have Byzantine fault tolerance that exceeds that. I'm sure I butchered the explanation of that, but I don't know if you want to clarify. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the point is under standard partial synchrony, you cannot go beyond I guess 33% in the partial synchrony with 3 rounds, or I guess we have this, you know, a better lower bound that we say in Hydrangea if you want to tolerate both crash and Byzantine faults. What the fault tolerance is going to be for under, so if there are F faults, so let me make the precise statement, right? If n equals 3F plus 2C plus K plus 1, where you're tolerating F Byzantine faults and C crash faults, then in the fast path, meaning when you're trying to commit with 2 rounds, then the maximum number of faults you can tolerate is C plus K by 2. So for basically for the setting where F equals 20% and C equals 20%, what this essentially means is that you cannot have, so let's, if you substitute F equals 20% and C equals 20% over here, then A has to be 0. And what this means is that in the fast path, the maximum you can tolerate is 10% faults. So it is not 20%. So I think the question at that point is, hey, Alpenglow said 20 plus 20. I'm not saying, I'm saying 20 plus 20 is not possible because a lower bound says, you know, you cannot achieve it. So what's the gap? the gap over here is that I guess everything that I'm speaking is under standard partial synchrony, whereas Alpenglow makes a very specific assumption with respect to when leaders do not equivocate, which is a specific synchrony style assumption. They call it assumption 3 in their paper. So under that assumption, they can get 20 plus 20, which is correct. So
see.
in fact, I guess
much better said. Thank you.
I think I've seen you, Kartik, argue on Twitter. This is where they're saying that because they use kind of the what is it called, like the VID style.
They have like the rotor voter thing, and then they use like the rotor mechanism as a means to justify that you can't practically have equivocation, which, yeah, to answer Ellie's comment, is a strong assumption.
Is it? Okay, I guess that was my question. Do we practically think that's a strong assumption, or is it just a theoretically?
We assume leaders can equivocate.
Okay.
So there are two things over here. One, is it a strong assumption? I think, yes, it is a strong assumption. But at the same time, I think the question is, a different way to reason about it is, if you had synchrony, what is possible? Because, if you move from partial synchrony to synchrony, we have this long line of work which talks about getting really efficient 2-round protocols, tolerating 49% Byzantine faults. And over there, you can get 2 rounds and 49%, and we already know that. So the question is, if I can give you some synchrony, can you solve this problem? And I guess in a sense, leader not equivocating or having some synchrony, it is a synchrony style assumption that they are making. So I think, in fact, I think we put this blog post out a couple of days ago on decentralized thoughts, which tried to see, what weak assumptions can you make and still try to get the same guarantees in that world.
Can you explain? Because so to me, it seems like actually a better assumption to make would be to assume a synchronous network rather than to assume that a leader will not equivocate. Because I actually think most networks today are like synchronous, so you can kind of like massage it a little bit to say that like it's synchronous enough. But then I guess you just said that like they're kind of the same thing. Or
the way they I guess the way they put it is, I think a leader does not equivocate, but I think a different way of doing it or different way of taking it is, if a leader equivocates, we could massage the protocol under a synchrony assumption in such a way that equivocation is detectable. And if it is detectable, we can deal with it differently. And I guess assuming that, you get this detectability for free, which you would get if you had synchrony, then you can do much better.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think it's really cool to think about how like the way that broadcast occurs, and then how you can kind of couple in kind of different assumptions based on what your application really needs about is something interesting. And in my opinion, I think the way that team pushed or reopened the door to some of those ideas was something that at least reawoken my curiosity in this direction of research. I will make no claims about what is better or not or whatever. Like, they're obviously extremely qualified researchers who know how Solana works and what Solana prioritizes for. But yeah, so I mean, I think because there's a whole conversation around how you couple efficient block broadcasts with this, which is like some of our work that I hopefully will release later this week. That takes it further than what the original Minimmit paper did. But yeah, for now, we'll just focus on the consensus component, which is really just assume that all that there is a commitment or a digest, and you're trying to have agreement over that commitment or digest. And at most, 20% are faulty or Byzantine in this model. And I think to build on what was said previously by Kartik, like Minimmit only has fast. There is no like slow path finalization that can occur. The only way to finalize is some view hits 80% finalization for some digest. And then the trick is that views can change though after only 40% have voted for something, which is different than protocols that have fast and slow path, where the fastest view can change is after 60% vote for something, at least as written. This is, again, not counting like optimistic proposals and whole nother level of complexity you can add into this. We're just talking about the consensus. All right. So as discussed, this is all under like the partial synchrony model. We assume everyone has a private key that they can use to sign messages, although there's probably a way to adapt this with authenticated channels to not have people use their private keys, but it makes the certificates larger. Again, we'll ignore that. And then to be clear about our fault model, that's the fault model. So, cool pictures. So, like I said before, you got votes to deal with and quorums. That's how you should be thinking about the ways to like kind of reorganize these different voting schemes and to get different agreement in certain ways. A core idea there is basically you have some number of votes to allocate, and they must be put somewhere. So if you assume, 20% Byzantine, that means that you can see, assuming all other parties are online, basically like 120% of N. So 80 plus 40. So you have the honest participants, 80, and then the Byzantine voters, let's say they can vote twice. So there could be enough votes hanging around, or do more than twice or whatever, but like they can, assuming that participants will drop any duplicate vote, which is what we do, you basically have that many votes to play with. And so the idea and how we back into some of this is to think about that. And then the key there is, when you want to think about how quorums can get weird, you basically have one participant, a Byzantine participant, send one vote to one set of people and then send a different vote to another set of people. And so what we care about is making sure that in those cases, something bad can't happen. And what bad can't happen means, at least in the case of Minimmit, and we'll get into like the protocol specification here shortly, is that if you move forward on a view, and then let's say nullification is created, so you can skip something, it should never be possible for that to be finalized. And if you do, it's broken. Because you've now basically with that nullification certificate or like a conflicting M notarization for a finalization, given the network a way to avoid a finalization, which is a safety fault in like the world of how you should think about these things. So, quorum intersection. So the idea in Minimmit, and I'm actually going to change, I'm going to come back to that diagram because I think it's clear. So the specification, you're a leader in view V. You broadcast something. So everyone else sets a timer for 2 delta. When you receive the leader's broadcast, you'll broadcast your vote. Assuming you haven't seen anything else, the first one. And if you haven't seen anything by the timeout, so the 2 delta you set, you vote timeout. That part's pretty similar to Simplex. We make some tweaks. So once you see 40% of a vote for some star, we allow you to move to V+1 with that, what we call an M notarization. You'll then broadcast the certificate representing basically 40% of vote for that value. If you see 80% of a vote for some B, you'll now finalize B and all of its ancestors. That again is very similar to kind of the Simplex model where like you see a finalization certificate and you finalize its ancestors. Same thing with the notarization, you move forward. Now, this alone is not sufficient because you can get stuck if there's equivocation. And so there's a little trick you need to add. And maybe this is not the right page. Oh, it's not. So you'll also move forward if you see a certificate, obviously, because that's the same thing as votes. Now, the trick is basically that if you see a 40% of votes for not B. So like you voted for something, you now see 40% for other stuff. You now say, oh, this is a timeout. Because you can't go just on 40% not B, because imagine the case a leader sends a different block to everybody. And we all vote. So we already voted. So now what happens, right? Like we're already like kind of on this path. We need to like get out of that initial condition where we're like locking for some vote. And so what we care about is we need to observe that there are at least enough votes out there such that a finalization cannot exist for something else. It would be impossible, assuming like the fault tolerance settings that we have. And so you basically say, all right, I'm gonna pull this ripcord. I've seen enough. I've been convinced that a finalization cannot exist for something that, basically for my vote, I'm going to try to skip this view. That's it. So nothing too fancy in terms of like how all these things can happen. And our claim is that basically from this simple set of rules, it's fast and it's safe. Now it assumes, again, like you're broadcasting a lot of messages to everybody. So, you know, you broadcast a certificate, you anycast, you know, your vote for some block. But basically with this initial vote approach, and then the ability to cast a timeout, that this alone ensures liveness and ensures safety. So we'll pause there, see if anyone has any specific questions. And before I do that, I'll say it one more time. So leader, we don't know if they're honest or not, broadcasts a vote for some block. When any participant sees that vote, if they haven't seen a vote before from that leader, they'll vote for that thing. But also, when they enter the view, set a timeout. And so if now, so we'll talk about the happy path first, actually, that makes more sense. So we vote on something, and the happy path, right? The leader does not equivocate. Everyone gets this block very quickly. Basically, everyone sees like about 40% of votes from everybody else, and then they move to view one. And then shortly thereafter, while they're already starting in view +1, they hear about 80% of votes, and they're like, oh, that's finalized, easy. Difficult case would be like, okay, let's say there's a bunch of people offline, and maybe there's only 60% of people online. You can see here that like if there's an honest leader, you'll get enough support to keep moving views, but not finalize. And so you could have a run of blocks on the tip that are notarized, or what we call an M notarization, but don't have an L notarization, or basically can't be finalized. And then there's the case basically where you have a leader that's dishonest. They send a bunch of blocks out to everybody. Everyone votes for something else. And they're like, well, this sucks. Now what do we do? Well, we've seen enough votes for stuff that we didn't vote for that we know that what we voted for can never be finalized. So now it's safe to issue basically a timeout vote. And then if people see enough timeout votes, they will skip to the next view. So those are kind of like the three paths through the maze. And then, you know, you can do whatever you want for like a leader election mechanism. In practice, we've found that having stable leaders in this model is extremely fast. Funny enough, like for people interested in like decentralized sequencers, Raft does view progression basically with 50%, or really like n-1 divided by 2 if you include the leader. Well, Minimmit moves at 40%. So depending on the size of your Raft cluster, if you don't have reorgs, like Minimmit can actually look faster view-wise than like a traditional Raft implementation, which is interesting. But it obviously has its own security assumptions that are very different. AKA, you can reorg Minimmit, you cannot reorg Raft in that model. But yeah, so we were pretty happy with really like the simplicity of the protocol because we had to implement it. But it is not without trade-off, right? So you lose like this additional crash fault tolerance resilience. You don't have this racing. So like basically Kudzu and Alpenglow and Hydrangea have this component where like when you vote, you kind of concurrently run the fast and the slow path. And so whatever finishes first kind of like wins. And the complexity in those protocols, and I'm not going to speak too much for them, is making sure that those paths are aligned so you can't conflict with each other. And so if you have in certain topologies, 60% of people very close to the proposer, sometimes like 2 rounds of 60 can be faster than 1 round of 80 for finalization. So sometimes the slow path actually becomes the fast path. And so it's interesting to have both running. But yeah, in practice, we found that the faster view progression we prefer to some of those other semantics. But yeah, I think it really depends on the application and what they're shooting for. So yeah, so that's the gist of it. So I'll pause there. I don't know if anyone has any specific questions.
I have, but I'm sure, yeah, I wanted to give a chance to others, Dalton.
I just have a question. So I might be oversimplifying this a bit, but it's 40% because we're assuming all faulty nodes are equivocating, which if they equivocated to the same block, if it's more than 40, we're but is that correct? Is that why it's 40 because of that?
So like I said, the important part is really that you don't have a like an M notarization, so that 40% that could differ from a finalization.
Gotcha. The only reason I'm asking this is because I'm thinking, like, could you lower the fault tolerance to 10% for you and then move it 20, or is this number adjustable?
So it's well, okay. I need to think about that question before I respond to anything. But like my claim is that you probably don't want to. So the big gaps and the big jumps in my mind are like when you go from 3-phase to 2-phase. And so the 3-phase jump is like when you go from 33% fault tolerance down to 20% fault tolerance, or squiggly line 20% fault tolerance. Going further, you can dabble with things. I think Vitalik actually, when he responded to like one of our posts, like was talking about some of like the ways that they were thinking about tweaking some of the Minimmit parameters in this way. So like, what if you had, I think they were thinking like 17% basically Byzantine fault tolerance to get certain parameters that they wanted. We have not spent much time thinking about like different ways to turn these knobs. And I'm content with 20%, basically like 20% tolerance and shooting for 40% approval. Because what can happen is that if you lower it more, you can have more conflicting proposals that need to be kind of decided upon after the fact. So if you require 40%, that means that 20% is honest. So I think you can have like 4 competing proposals, each with 40% technically, 20% honest plus 20% Byzantine per proposal. Depending on how when people see these certificates, if the certificates are attributable, all of that. But that's like the worst case scenario. If you keep lowering that, basically you can have more proposals, which for an honest, like a dishonest proposer can cause like some overhead on the network. And this was like some of the original concerns brought up when we first announced like the blog and like the project. Was someone, I think from Category Labs or Monad, basically was like, all right, well, if there's a network partition, you can have 2 sides of the network each keep going on the notarization side. So I think in Dankrad's blog, he eloquently relabeled this like dynamic availability, and that like you can kind of have both going and then one will win. I think what we concluded is basically the side that's longest will most likely win, but they're both reorgable chains. So you could have, basically one side's going to have a massive reorg. So the more you allow like these conflicting notarizations, like the more painful that can become. But in like an honest, like let's say that you knew the proposer was probably honest, you could do some stuff like this. But I would almost advocate to say that if you're trying those games, optimistic proposal may be more useful to you, so you don't actually have to redo any of the security proofs or like liveness proofs in these circumstances, because that is often the more annoying part. So long story short, you can always twist the knobs. I'm not going to make any claims about whether or not it's a good idea to go down to something like that. I prefer to stay at the 20%, and then if you want to go faster, to think about some more like optimistic proposal stuff rather than trying to lower the threshold to 20%. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, it makes sense. I wasn't actually considering getting a lower fault tolerance. I was more just curious if you thought about it, but thank you.
Yeah, we have not spent much time thinking about that. We've been so like the two things we've been most surprised at when people bring up Minimmit is, one, how many people are interested in like oh wait, you mean it can keep going if only 40% of people are around, which that was not something I thought about at all when working on this project, or even during the whole paper process. And then turns out that was very interesting to some people. Obviously it's not finalization, but like that it can like kind of do this like mini commit thing below that, or sorry, up to basically at that threshold, which was something I hadn't considered. And then the other one was like some people want to tune it even more than this, and I was like, like no one tunes the 13% number, so like kind of like why would you want to go down to 15 from 20% Byzantine fault tolerance? But I think when you start to layer in some of like the liveness detection stuff, which Andy, one of our co-authors, has spent a lot of time on with like Joachim and some folks at A16Z, that there can be under certain network conditions reasons to do some of this stuff. But I mean, with consensus, it's like you pull one string, like 15 other strings come undone. So you got to be real careful. Like for example, if you lower the F, that means you need to have basically bigger chunks you're sending, or like bigger chunks you're sending out with erasure coding. And so like you'd probably prefer to keep the setting where it is to then balance that broadcast kind of consideration better. But yeah, it depends entirely on what your application is. Yeah. So good question. I don't know.
Yeah, I had a question, I guess, to follow up on this, because you were comparing to Raft. So my question is maybe a little bit like the philosophical side of everything you talked about, but I guess we're all, because we're working on blockchains, coming from the BFT, and we're like, okay, how do we make it either go faster or kind of get a bit closer to the 51% mark, depending on the side that you take. So, but then you comparing to Raft, I guess my question is like philosophically, where do these like 5F+1 protocols fall? Would you say they're kind of closer to the BFT side or closer to the CFT side?
Well, strictly BFT side, yeah. I mean, I think if you only cared about CFT, you'd probably do a lot differently. Yeah, so you should think about this as like the penalty. Like a lot of these decisions are the penalty we pay for BFT. Yeah. Yeah, like for example, in the RAP case, just bringing that back up, right? That N/2 you need, or like N-1 if you don't include the leader, like that's final.
Right. But okay, like, but the question stands as well. Could you take a CFT protocol and then just kind of, allow not like immediate finalization with like
that was something I thought about as well. Like, can you like kind of minimify like a Raft or like a CFT thing? Like, again, I was like, seems like you could try to apply like the same tricks, like given the same possibility results. But most people in the CFT world, like they only want finality. Like nothing else satisfies. So like if you want to give them like, oh yeah, it's like you could reorg though, like you're like, well, at that point, like you're useless to me because all I care about. Like I'm running some database, like I want to know that the log is finalized, like nothing else matters to me. So I don't know like what the actual usefulness of that is for those models. I think it's interesting for like maybe if you assume like your decentralized sequencer cluster is mostly honest, and that like during times of asynchrony, like maybe you'll allow like some weirdness to happen. But again, even those people, like they never want to have an invalid or like kind of gets into a whole different world of like whether or not that's a good idea. Long story short, when we talk to people, no one's really interested in the CFT world, so we have not spent any time optimizing for it. But I mean, there's extremely smart people that have been working on databases in like the Web2 world for a long time, and I would suspect what they're doing is probably pretty close to the optimal. And I would not claim there's like some sort of like, oh yeah, just do this. I think they would have thought about that, and there's probably 10 papers already evaluating why it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Web2 Google money is a very different research funnel than Web3 crypto money. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, 100%. And then maybe quickly a dumb question to actually understand this. So when we're talking about equivocation, are we only talking about voting for two separate blocks, or does like the nullifying kind of vote also count as equivocating?
No, so there's it's very, so basically the important part here is this or in the vote or timeout. So in Simplex, when you vote, you can also, just without doing anything else, also send a timeout immediately if you wanted to. You can send both. Doesn't matter. The important part is you don't send nullify, what we call nullify, or like a vote for the dummy block, and finalization. That's invalid. In this protocol, because it is in like the two-phase setting, you kind of have to compress those ideas. And the way that those are compressed is basically you vote or you time out. And then only if you see enough conflicting are you willing to then issue a timeout after your vote. Because the key there, right, is like you can, if some block is finalized or it has a path to become finalized, there cannot exist a way to bypass it. And so if you have a timeout certificate that exists, you can bypass it. And then due to synchrony, like you could then basically finalize two blocks. One that's actually, this is hilariously the next slide that Brendan wrote, so this is perfect. You can fuck this up pretty bad if you're not careful. So it's really like, when you think about this, it's about choice. Is there a path to go from a block that has or does not have enough support to bypass some finalization? So here's an example, right, where like, let's say that, first block, Genesis, we all agree. Great. Next block, okay, we got 91% of people voting for it and then 5% that just never got it. Okay. Now things get interesting. Let's say there's 72% of people that vote for the next block. Well, not going to get finalized, but no way around it. There's no completing proposal that has 40% support. Okay. But you don't know that. It could. Like there's votes that are not accounted for. So now the next leader has a choice. Well, not really a choice because they have to build on some certificate. But let's say the next leader now is malicious. They now send a block out to some people to get enough for 40. They send a different block out to another people to get enough for a different 40. And then there's a whole nother set here, which I'm sure Brendan would have described this much more eloquently than I am. But in any case, what can happen is that when you're doing the next block, you have a choice. The next leader can choose to build on any of the M notarizations. This N, sorry, is the skip. Basically, people see enough of the other that they time out. But yeah, so what can happen is to say, okay, I'm a malicious leader. I sent it to two separate people, like two separate groups of people. So now I got 40% for both. Great. They've now both entered the next view with different M notarizations. The next leader could choose to build on either one of those. Both are valid. So the problem becomes, well, if one of those is going to get finalized directly, so have 80%, you should never be able to build on anything else, because then you can bypass that block that's going to be that is finalized or basically directly finalized, which would be a safety fault. So this is the quorum thing you have to be really careful of. And that's why it's so specific. So if you were to, let's say, vote, and then you were also allowed to time out right away, then you could trivially have a case where like you just vote and before a certificate shows up, like, so let's say that I'm a malicious proposer and I wait till right before the timeout. I send my block out. You vote just like you would in Simplex, and then oops, haven't seen enough votes from anybody else yet, no certificate yet, I'm going to vote timeout. But 80% of people actually voted. Now you have a certificate for timeout and a finalization. Can't happen. So that's why there's like some instinct around like you can vote once, but if you vote, you can't time out. And if you can vote but not time out, that should set an alarm bell off in your head that says, wow, this could get stuck because I can no longer leave this view if something goes south. And so that's the important part around, oh, I've observed enough other votes that there's no way my vote can get finalized. So now I'm willing to release and go to timeout because I know that I cannot be part of some certificate that then allows us to basically have a notarized for the dummy block or like a timeout and a finalization exist. Yeah. So when I heard that, this is what I was saying, when I heard it for the first time, I was like, there's no way this works. But yeah, turns out it works. And so, yeah, and that's the quorum game you're playing. Is basically there's not enough votes to finalize your vote if you see 40% of votes for anything else. That's the claim. That's what this like quorum thing that was originally here meant to show.
I think that makes sense. I'll definitely have to go read the blog again to figure it out. But is there like a simple, it's probably not possible, but like, you know, a simple kind of table summarizing, let's say the Simplex, Minimmit, and like Kudzu, and what kind
We
of
do have comparisons in our in the Minimmit paper, but like what I'd recommend actually for people that want to get a really simple intuition was actually the Minimmit blog we wrote, because we wrote that before the paper. And we wrote it actually in like painfully plain English, with like an intuition around like the general safety and liveness considerations. So like why certain things we think are, this was before we had the paper, right? So this was me and Brandon, you know, basically saying like, this is safe because this is the intuition. And yeah, and then fortunately Andy helped us turn that into a real tight proof. But this was like pre-proof days. So if you're looking for more like an intuition for why this makes sense, it's a great source. Yeah. But yeah, so the safety proofs basically align on those two things, which is like you can't have an 80-40. The existence of that would be a contradiction, is the claim, because there's just not enough votes. And then the liveness claim is basically that no matter what, we're going to get some 40% certificate, whether that's for a block or a timeout. Eventually, we're going to exit this view. And that when people exit the view, we spend enough time in the same view that we can actually notarize and finalize in the next view before a timeout. And that's the whole magic of Simplex, where you broadcast certificates, and under synchrony, you expect people to align their views in so much time, and then given the timeout, that you should have enough time to basically participate. Yeah. So that's the intuition, at least, though, is you don't want an M notarized that conflicts with an L notarized. An M notarized is this 40% thing, the L notarized is the 80%. And then the liveness is to basically say, no matter what the leader does, or like whatever the network's doing, eventually I'm going to end up in a view where we have enough people to finalize a block if there's an honest leader. Yeah.
Mars has a question.
Oh, sorry, there's a few questions here. Oh, whoa, it orders them now. Very nice, Google. All right, go ahead, Dimar.
Yes, I wonder what the properties on the ordering are. Cool. Well, thank you so much. This was so informative. I think even just hearing your thoughts around how you think about consensus was like half of the masters in consensus or something. Or
You just
at
have to
least-
have enough mentors that you can get a education. That's been my philosophy. Enough
I
smart
see.
people have spent enough time trying to teach me that I feel like I have some grasp of the straws. That's all.
Amazing. My question was going to be is more R&D. So I think we talked about a lot of ways like that you could take different assumptions or parameterizations of just like protocol or family of protocols. I'm curious what you think are the most interesting R&D directions going forward on this for like a consensus researcher.
Yeah, so what's coming shortly is basically intelligently coupling erasure coding. So the big problem, if you lower like from 60 to 40, is that naively for view progression, you basically need more pieces. You need F+1 chunks should be enough to recover the block rather than 2 F+1. And so if you're not careful, that basically can like totally undermine the whole benefit of things, because basically you hit like network bandwidth limits before like you benefit from the speed. If you have unlimited bandwidth, it's better. If you don't have unlimited bandwidth, eventually there's a point where something with like basically a 3F+1 view progression will outperform, because enough honest people have pieces. So yeah, we have a paper or like an addendum to Minimmit coming shortly that basically makes it equivalent through some very insightful work of Andy. So I'll avoid sharing anything specific until then. But if you look at the Minimmit paper today, what you'll see is a comparison chart that shows that under limited bandwidth, like Kudzu outperforms Minimmit at some basically block size, and then when you ramp up the bandwidth, Minimmit outperforms again. So the first one is like, can we compete with lower bandwidth if we're intelligent about how we do erasure coding? The second one is optimistic proposals. So right now we just do like something pretty naive, which is like if you iterate, you basically do block times whenever you get a M notarization. You can be a little bit more intelligent and optimistic, and then kind of drive down the latency there if you're smart with leader election and smart with how you actually broadcast the block around. So yeah, we're dabbling in that too. I think the interesting and funny thing with that is like no application actually wants to go that fast, or like very few do, because the data created is immense. And so like it becomes extremely expensive. So like, for example, if you run at like 100K TPS for a day and you assume transactions are 200 bytes, you're basically like clocking in like 1.7 terabytes of data per day. Now, if you look at some basic math, right, like AWS, like the biggest Postgres instance, you're talking like 256 terabytes. So like you're filling that thing up in like half a year, and if you don't go bankrupt first. And so yeah, you start to hit some like walls that are unrelated to this, which are interesting to consider if you actually want to like make it indexable. And I don't think it's basically not a thing of like, can it be indexable? Obviously there's a way. I think the thing, as people have shown, is like the more expensive it is, the less people will do it. And so I think there's a really interesting balance there between like how hard you actually want to push throughput versus like what the right balance is maybe for like a decentralized network. They may be different things. So it'll be interesting to see how people turn the knobs based on what application they're building. But those would be my two. Yeah. Funny enough, we originally blocked by one about how to adapt threshold signatures to this, because you have two quorum thresholds, like 40 and 80. But the way that we did it is actually that you use multi-signature of partial signatures for the 40, and then you do the threshold signature recovery for the 80. So it actually works pretty well, but you lose the embedded VRF in Minimmit, which we have in Simplex. But for a lot of applications, that's okay, because they're using Minimmit to go fast, and they probably want to do stable leaders, in which case the VRF is not that important for that. And you probably want to do the VRF construction after finalization to avoid any sort of like reordering games or like trying to guess how deep the seed should be revealed in like the application. So that's a whole other can of worms we don't have time to cover. But yeah, sorry, there's a few other questions. I don't know who I see. Is that Amaya is how you pronounce it? Sorry. I'm from Wisconsin, so I unfortunately did not get a wide vocabulary.
Anyways, yeah, I guess my question is, I assume like you started sort of writing the paper assuming like a 5f+1 bound. I mean, is my understanding, but how do you come to like an 80-40 balance for like the quorum intersection? Why not say like 70-50? Because even that gives like a 20% bound, right? So why?
So the idea is basically you have 80% of the network which is honest, 20% which is dishonest. Okay. Now remember, the thing we care about, can we have a conflicting M notarization and L notarization? And we assume that honest people will only vote once. Reasonable. Okay. So we have this set up. Now, what do we need to form such a situation? We need 60% of the honest people to vote for some L. And then we need 20% honest to vote for a different M. So we're walking exactly the line with this setup. If you changed it to 70%, we'd only need 50% honest to participate in the L. And then you could have conflicting M's. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is why when I look at like papers, like, you know, I was mentioning like Kudzu and hydrangea and some of the other ones that like have this like really interesting race of the fast and slow path, I'm like, hats off to you for figuring out how to keep these quorums safe with these different paths and everything. But yeah, it's above my pay grade. So I'm happy with this very dumb and simple approach, and I don't need to go any further. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's the intuition, though, exactly what you asked. It's like once you see that, you're like, okay, I get it now. And it's obviously easy to write in hindsight, but that leap took us, I don't know, 3 weeks of staring at a wall for like 6 hours a day. So yeah. Just to pull the cover back on how some of this consensus research works, half of it is just slamming your head against a wall until all of a sudden you have an idea, and then usually it's wrong, and then you try again. And then eventually maybe you may find something interesting. Yeah. At least that's my approach to research. Yeah.
Awesome.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm curious. I think, Mikhail, you had your hand up. I don't know if you put it down by mistake or if someone else answered the question. Otherwise, did you have more material you want to go over, Patrick, or was like pretty much the end of the
This is pretty much it. Yeah.
Awesome. If we have, maybe we can take 5. I'd be curious to go over like Tobias's question. I think, especially since you're talking about potentially also going to you know, using, I don't know, Reed Solomon or whatever kind of dispersal stuff like Rotor does.
Yeah. Is he still here? I don't know if he wants to ask it or explain what his point was.
Yeah, I'm still here. So sorry about this. I think essentially because they have this two-phase protocol for block dissemination, and they're voting on the full block, right? They're not voting on the on just the root, the Merkle root, essentially. And so because they have this two-phase block dissemination protocol, they can kind of get away with the fact that you're likely to detect the equivocation during those 2 phases. But like in a sense, you know, maybe that's not optimal because you should arguably vote on the Merkle root because that saves you 1 round during the block dissemination phase. So yeah, I think it's kind of wrong to portray it as they assume non-equivocation because I think they are just like their protocol provides under synchrony equivocation detection during the block dissemination. But I don't think that that's the way to go. I think the way to go is to do that dispersed simplex thing where you essentially vote on the Merkle roots instead. And I guess it's similar to what you guys are doing.
Yeah, we have a version of Simplex called with deferred verification, we call it, which does basically that voting on the root with erasure coding rather than waiting for basically to vote on the block itself, which is what a lot. So like, your point about Solana and Alpenglow and Monad, they all wait to like reconstruct the block locally before they vote. And so Simplex, because of this, like, you could obviously find a way to do it with other consensus mechanisms, but Simplex makes it nice to be able to basically vote once you have the data. And then there's like this separate certify step that runs after you have a certificate where you can choose to finalize or not based on whether or not the block itself is valid. So that's what we also, our Simplex implementation does that, and Minimmit will do the same sort of thing. Well, sorry, Minimmit can't do that because it's only one phase or two phase voting. So I take that back. Simplex does that. That's a downside of Minimmit.
And then just to close the loop, to make sure I understand the link between Tobias, what you were saying, or basically the assumption 3 in the paper and the synchrony assumption that Kartik is talking about, is the idea that you kind of, if you want to equivocate in such a thing, you kind of take 2 blocks, you break them down, you send the shards to everyone, and then everyone will kind of, like, I just don't understand how you even try to hide that, I guess is my question. Because basically to lie to 33%, you have to lie to the whole group, or am I missing something?
It's basically around how, like, when you choose to forward the shard, like, have you seen a shard already from that leader?
Can you extend
That
it?
makes sense. I think they have some cool images I can show here that maybe make this clearer.
Essentially, Alpenglow, you first collect enough shards to decode the block, right? So that requires like F+1 shards, I guess. And then if there's equivocation, because those shards, you don't receive them directly from the leader, they're relayed via all the other validators or via some relay nodes. If the leader does equivocate, it is very likely that among the first F+1 shards that you receive, if there's equivocation, you would see conflicting shards. And in that case, you just don't vote for anything. Right?
I see. I think I see.
But again, it's kind of exploiting the fact that it has a 2-phase block dissemination protocol.
Gotcha.
So I think in Alpenglow, they target, if I'm not mistaken, like a 400 millisecond block time still, right? It's like a time-based thing, and then they finalize faster. That's the big change in Alpenglow. So instead of like the existing turbine consensus or whatever, that it's a faster finalization, but they don't actually attempt to lower the block time, if I'm not mistaken. So that gives enough time for this block broadcast and then vote to happen. Yeah. So it's a little different. So like, for example, if you do this like kind of interleaved erasure coded broadcast modulo, the actual time it takes to produce those chunks, you can have faster view progression because you don't wait for this 2-step to happen before voting. You like vote as part of the first step, which is really nice. But to me, this is why very early on during the conversation, I was like, okay, let's put this conversation in a little box, which is like agreement on digest, and then you can really get fancy with how those digests are given meaning. Yeah. And I think that's a really cool area for people to explore, and they obviously have been exploring it in really pristine detail. And we have a Zoda implementation as well, for example. And so that's an interesting scheme to attach to something like a Minimmit, where like you want to ensure that the block that you get is actually a part of a valid encoding, which you can't necessarily do with just like a piece of Beat Solomon. You would need to couple that with like a KZG proof or something else, and Zoda is a lot faster than that. So that opens up a whole different realm of research if you want to like do a similar thing in Minimmit. So yeah, turtles all the way down. I'd just say like, yeah.
Nice. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for this. This was super, super fun. I think we should break off, but since Karthik is here, Karthik, are you still open to presenting the next one? I think you wanted to talk about the pipes model.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. Sure.
Is that still your favorite to present, or would you prefer, given the conversations, to present the hydrangea and then like inform us even better on the 5F+1 models and stuff? I don't know also what people prefer in the audience. We can vote maybe in Telegram.
Sounds good. I could do either.
You can do either. No preferences.
I think pipes will be slightly better, but hydrangea is, yeah, I think both of them are great topics, I guess, given the set of topics that we've spoken about.
Okay, awesome. I think let's put pipes as we had agreed. I mean, I'll mention in Telegram, and then if people really want to see hydrangea instead, we can do that. But otherwise, I'll put pipes on the menu. Probably maybe 3 weeks from now to give people a break. Okay, again, Patrick, thanks a lot for this. This was really nice.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Like I shared at the beginning too, we just put out our initial implementation of Minimmit with some results too. So if you're curious what it looks like in code, you should be able to check it out and run it too, which is pretty fun. So yeah, if you like Rust, you're in luck. If you don't, maybe not, but talk to you guys later.